The fire crackled softly, its amber glow stretching shadows across the trees. The night was heavy, almost suffocating. A low mist crept through the forest, curling around the tents like ghostly fingers. Leaves rustled, whispering secrets to the wind. The Henderson family sat close, the warmth of the fire a fragile comfort. Mary stirred the pot of chili, her hand trembling slightly. She glanced at her husband, John, who poked at the fire with a stick. Their teenage son, Brian, had wandered off earlier. Just to explore, he'd said. But it had been over an hour now. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against their skin. An owl hooted in the distance, its call sharp and mournful. John stood suddenly, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Brian," he called. His voice echoed, swallowed quickly by the trees. No response came. Mary's heart thudded in her chest. Her younger daughter, Sophie, clutched her stuffed bear tighter. "I don't like it here," Sophie whispered, her voice quivering. John grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the shadows. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating nothing but endless trees. "Stay here," he ordered. Mary wanted to protest, but couldn't find the words. Minutes ticked by. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward. Sophie began to cry softly. A sudden sound, a snap of a twig. Mary's head whipped around.
"John," she called.
No answer. The forest felt alive, watching, waiting. Another noise, a low, guttural growl. Mary froze. It was too close. The mist seemed to move now, shifting unnaturally, curling into the campsite. And then, from the darkness, Brian emerged. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror. Blood smeared his shirt. "Mom," he gasped, his voice barely audible. Behind him, a shadow loomed. Too tall, too distorted. Mary screamed. The scream ripped through the night, sharp and raw. Brian stumbled forward, collapsing to his knees. "Run," he croaked, his voice cracked with panic. The shadow behind him moved closer. The firelight caught a glint of something, metal, wet and gleaming. Mary grabbed Sophie, clutching her so tightly the child whimpered. John burst back into the clearing, his flashlight beam shaking as he ran. "What the hell is going on?" he yelled, eyes darting between Brian and the encroaching darkness. Brian tried to speak, but a choked sob escaped instead. "They're coming," he managed to whisper, pointing into the woods.
No one had time to ask.
A deafening crash came from the treeline, branches snapping like brittle bones. Something heavy moved, dragging itself closer with unnatural speed. The air reeked suddenly, iron, rot, and decay. Mary gagged, pulling Sophie toward the car parked at the edge of the campsite. "We have to go."
"Now."
John grabbed Brian, hauling him to his feet. "Move," he barked, shoving the boy toward the car. The firelight flickered violently, threatening to extinguish. Something stepped into the light. It was tall, its limbs wrong, too long, too thin. Its face was obscured, but the sound it made, a low, inhuman moan, sent chills crawling up their spines. John froze, flashlight trembling in his grip. "Get in the car," he shouted over his shoulder, his voice breaking. Mary yanked the car door open, shoving Sophie inside. Brian collapsed into the back seat, gasping for air. John backed toward the car, his eyes never leaving the figure. But it wasn't alone. From the woods, more shapes emerged.
Silent.
Watching. The fire died, plunging the campsite into near darkness. Mary screamed again, the sound lost in the chaos of crunching leaves and pounding hearts. John dove into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. The key fumbled in his hand. "Start the car," Mary cried, her voice shrill with terror. But the engine sputtered, refusing to catch. The figures drew closer, surrounding them now. Their eyes, if they had any, glowed faintly in the moonlight. And then the pounding began. Fists, claws, Something heavy slammed against the car windows, rattling the frame. Sophie screamed, burying her face in Mary's chest. John turned the key again, harder this time. The engine roared to life. For a moment, hope surged in their chests. And then the driver's side window shattered. Glass exploded inward, slicing across John's face. He recoiled with a yell, blood dripping down his cheek. A hand, or what might have been a hand, thrust through the shattered window. Long, gnarled fingers clawed at him, their nails blackened and jagged. Mary screamed, slamming her fists against the dashboard in panic. "Drive, John. Just go." John gritted his teeth, slamming the car into reverse. The tires screeched, kicking up gravel as the vehicle lurched backward. The creature's arm twisted grotesquely as it was wrenched free of the car. More figures closed in, their forms barely visible through the haze of panic and mist. One leaped onto the hood, its face pressing against the windshield. It had no eyes, just smooth, gray flesh stretched too tight over a skull. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of uneven, needle-like teeth. Mary turned in her seat, clutching Sophie tighter as Brian clawed at the door handle, desperate to escape. "Stay inside," she shouted, her voice breaking. The creature on the hood began pounding on the windshield, cracks spidering across the glass. John slammed the car into drive, the tires spinning wildly before catching traction. The car shot forward, flinging the creature from the hood. It hit the ground with a sickening crunch, but the others were relentless. They clawed at the sides of the vehicle, their distorted faces pressed against the windows. One of them clung to the roof, its nails scraping against the metal, shrieking like tortured steel. "Faster!" Mary cried, her voice trembling. John pressed the pedal to the floor, the car bouncing violently over the uneven terrain. The forest around them blurred, trees whipping past in a chaotic blur. The creatures didn't falter. Their forms twisted and shifted, moving unnaturally fast, keeping pace with the car. One lunged from the side, its claws raking across Brian's window. The boy screamed, pressing himself as far back as he could. "Hold on," John shouted, jerking the wheel sharply. The car veered off the dirt path, plunging into the thicker forest. Branches snapped against the windows, the headlights illuminating fleeting glimpses of the horrors chasing them. But then the car jolted violently, the front end sinking into something deep and soft.
Mud.
The wheels spun uselessly, throwing up sprays of muck. "No, no, no!" John yelled, slamming the accelerator again. The creatures surrounded them, their moans rising in a terrible chorus. Mary turned to Brian, her voice a whisper now, trembling with fear.
"Don't look, baby."
"Just don't look." But Brian's wide eyes were locked on the figures pressing against the glass. And Sophie sobbed quietly, clutching her bear, as the car filled with the sound of cracking metal. The roof groaned under the weight of something heavy. Claws tore into the metal, peeling it back like a tin can. John threw the car into reverse again, desperate to free them from the mud. The engine roared, the wheels spun, but they were trapped. Mary grabbed Sophie and Brian, pulling them down onto the floor. "Get down. Stay low," she shouted, shielding them with her body. The windows buckled, the glass fracturing further with each relentless blow. A guttural howl erupted from the roof, shaking the entire car. John reached for the tire iron under his seat, his knuckles white with fear. The roof finally gave way. A long, skeletal arm punched through, its claws slashing wildly. John swung the tire iron, connecting with a sickening crack. The creature hissed, its head snapping into view through the torn metal. Its face was inches from his, its breath rancid, eyes glowing faintly with a sick, unnatural light. John screamed, swinging the tire iron again, forcing the creature back temporarily. But the others were relentless. From the driver's side, a second figure wedged its head through the shattered window. Its jaw unhinged, drool dripping onto John's arm as it snapped at him. Mary was screaming now, a raw, primal sound of terror. Brian clutched her tightly, his face buried in her side. Sophie whimpered, rocking back and forth, her tiny hands gripping her bear. The car rocked violently as more creatures swarmed it. John turned, his voice a desperate roar.
Get out.
Run. Mary hesitated, her mind torn between obeying and the overwhelming fear of leaving the fragile safety of the car.
Now.
John shouted, swinging wildly at the nearest creature. Mary grabbed the door handle, yanking it open. She pulled Brian and Sophie with her, her bare feet sinking into the cold mud as they tumbled out. Where do we go? Brian yelled, his voice cracking. Mary didn't answer. She just ran, dragging Sophie and pushing Brian ahead of her. Behind them, the car filled with guttural growls and screams. John's voice echoed briefly, a cry of rage and pain. Then, silence. The forest swallowed them, the mist closing in thicker now. Branches clawed at their skin as they stumbled forward blindly, their breaths ragged. But the sounds returned. The heavy, wet thuds of footsteps. The moaning. The creatures were following. Closer. Always closer. Mary's legs burned as she pushed forward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Sophie clung to her arm, her little feet slipping in the mud. Brian stumbled ahead, turning back every few seconds, his eyes wide with terror. They're catching up, he yelled, his voice cracking. Mary didn't dare look back. The sounds of the creatures grew louder, branches snapping, guttural breaths rasping in the dark. Keep going, she screamed, her voice barely her own. The forest seemed endless, an oppressive maze of twisting trees and clawing shadows. Sophie tripped, her knees buckling beneath her. Mom, she cried, her tiny voice breaking. Mary stopped, pulling her daughter back to her feet. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for something, anything, that could save them. A faint light glimmered through the trees. Over there, Brian shouted, pointing frantically. Mary didn't question it. She dragged Sophie toward the light, hope flickering faintly in her chest. As they broke through the tree-line, they stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood a small, dilapidated cabin. Its windows were boarded, the wood dark and weathered with age. Inside, Mary commanded, shoving Brian toward the door. The boy threw himself against it, the rotting wood creaking but holding firm. It's locked, he cried, pounding on the door. Mary looked back. The figures were emerging from the trees, their distorted shapes illuminated by the pale moonlight. Their movements were jerky, almost insect-like, as they closed in. Break it down, Mary screamed. Brian kicked at the door with everything he had, the old wood splintering under his foot. With one final shove, it burst open. They tumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind them. Mary dropped Sophie onto the floor, her hands fumbling for a lock or a bolt. There was none. Find something to block it, she shouted. Brian grabbed a heavy, broken chair, wedging it under the doorknob. The cabin was suffocatingly dark, the only light seeping through cracks in the boards. The walls seemed to pulse with dampness, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Sophie clung to Mary, her tiny body trembling uncontrollably. Are they gone? Brian whispered, his voice shaking. A deafening bang answered him. The door rattled, the creatures slamming against it with inhuman force. Each impact shook the fragile cabin, dust raining from the ceiling. They're getting in, Brian yelled, backing away. Mary grabbed a rusted metal poker from the fireplace, holding it like a weapon. Her hands shook, but her grip was firm. We won't let them, she said, her voice low, almost a growl. The door splintered, claws tearing through the wood. Eyes glowed from the cracks, staring hungrily at them. Sophie screamed, burying her face in Mary's side. The pounding grew louder, more frantic. Mary's knuckles whitened around the poker. Stay behind me, she whispered. And then the door gave way. The door exploded inward, shards of wood flying like shrapnel. The chair skidded across the floor, useless against the force. The first creature stepped inside, its twisted frame hunched and jerking unnaturally. Its head tilted as it took in the scene, the faint glow of its eyes locking onto them. Mary gripped the rusted poker tighter, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice trembling. The creature lunged. Mary swung the poker with everything she had. It connected with a sickening crunch, the creature recoiling, its head snapping back. But it didn't fall. It growled, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the cabin. Behind it, more figures pushed through the shattered doorway, their distorted forms filling the space. "Mom!" Brian screamed, retreating to the far wall. Sophie was sobbing uncontrollably now, clinging to Mary's leg. Mary swung again, the poker catching another creature across the face. It staggered, but the others pressed forward, undeterred. She backed up, forcing her children behind her. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. The cabin's single window was boarded, the gaps too narrow to squeeze through. The creatures advanced, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Mary's breath hitched, the walls closing in around them. "Brian, find something?" "Anything," she screamed. The boy scrambled to the corner, grabbing a loose plank of wood. He swung it wildly, tears streaming down his face. One of the creatures grabbed the plank mid-swing, snapping it in half with an unnatural strength. Brian fell back, crawling away in terror. "Leave him alone," Mary roared, thrusting the poker into the nearest creature's chest. The tip sank in, black ichor spilling from the wound. But it didn't stop. It grabbed the poker, yanking it from her hands with ease. Mary stumbled, her back hitting the wall. The creatures loomed over her now, their foul breath filling the air. Sophie's cries were muffled, her face buried in Mary's dress. Brian screamed again, a sound so raw it made Mary's chest ache. And then the cabin seemed to shift. A low rumble reverberated through the floorboards. The creatures froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. It was deep, guttural, almost a growl, but not from them. Something else was out there. Something bigger. The creatures hesitated, their glowing eyes flickering. And for the first time, Mary saw something in them.
Fear.
The rumble grew louder, closer, shaking the very walls. And then, from the darkness beyond the doorway, it came. It stepped into the shattered doorway, and the air itself seemed to recoil. The thing was massive, its shape barely human, a grotesque blend of shadow and flesh. Its skin glistened like oil, stretched impossibly tight over bulging muscles. Its head brushed the low ceiling, tilting as it took in the scene. Eyes, if they could be called that, burned like embers, deep and smoldering, piercing through the gloom. The smaller creatures shrank back, their guttural growls turning to whimpers. Mary felt the floor vibrate beneath its steps, her body trembling uncontrollably. The stench of rot and sulfur grew unbearable, filling the tiny cabin with its oppressive weight. It didn't lunge. It didn't rush. It simply moved forward, deliberate, predatory. The smaller creatures scattered, retreating into the night like frightened animals. Mary's breath hitched, her instincts screaming to run, but there was nowhere to go. "Mom," Brian whispered, his voice barely audible. Mary pushed Sophie behind her, shielding both children with her body. The thing stopped a few feet from her, its towering form blocking the doorway completely. It tilted its head again, studying her, almost curious. Mary's knees buckled, but she refused to fall. Her hands trembled, useless and empty without the poker. It leaned closer, the heat radiating off its body like a furnace. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. A sound escaped it, not a growl, but a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate inside her chest. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to meet its burning gaze. "Leave us alone," she whispered, her voice shaking but defiant. The thing paused, its ember-like eyes narrowing slightly. For a brief, flickering moment, she thought it might listen. Then it moved. Its hand, massive and clawed, shot out with impossible speed, grabbing her by the arm. She screamed, the force lifting her off the ground. "Mom!" Brian yelled, rushing forward. "Stay back," she cried, her voice raw with panic. But Brian didn't stop. He grabbed a jagged piece of wood, slamming it into the creature's side. It barely flinched. With a flick of its arm, it sent Brian flying across the room, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. "No," Mary screamed, tears streaming down her face. Sophie wailed, her tiny hands clutching Mary's leg as the creature dragged her closer. Its ember eyes locked onto hers, unyielding and merciless. The heat grew unbearable, the world narrowing to this single, horrifying moment. And then, from behind it, came another sound. A sharp, piercing whistle, high and unnatural, cutting through the chaos. The creature froze, its head snapping toward the sound. Its grip on Mary loosened slightly, just enough for her to fall to the ground. The whistle grew louder, more insistent, reverberating through the cabin like a warning. The thing hesitated, its ember eyes flickering uncertainly. And then, with a guttural snarl, it turned and disappeared into the night. The cabin fell silent, save for Mary's ragged breaths and Sophie's muffled sobs. She crawled to Brian, who lay motionless against the wall. "Brian, baby, please," she whispered, shaking him gently. His eyes fluttered open, and a weak groan escaped his lips. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. Whatever had made that whistle was still out there, and it was coming closer. The whistle turned into a low, rhythmic hum, each note vibrating through the cabin like a pulse. Mary's heart pounded, her hands shaking as she pulled Brian into her lap. He groaned, wincing at every movement, his breath shallow. "Stay with me," she whispered, stroking his hair, her voice barely audible over the rising hum. Sophie clung to Mary's side, her wide, tear-streaked eyes fixed on the open doorway. The sound grew louder, more dissonant, filling the air with a strange, almost hypnotic cadence. The trees outside began to sway, though there was no wind. Shadows flickered unnaturally, stretching and twisting across the walls of the cabin. Mary tightened her grip on Brian, her eyes darting toward the shattered door. Something was approaching, but it wasn't like the creatures from before. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Then it appeared. A figure, cloaked in darkness, stepped into the doorway. Its outline was vague, constantly shifting, as if it couldn't hold its form in this world. It didn't have eyes, but Mary could feel its gaze piercing through her. A deep, resonant voice filled the cabin, not spoken, but heard inside her head. "You should not have come here." Mary's lips trembled, her voice failing her. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating, as though it absorbed all the light and sound around it. The hum stopped abruptly, plunging the cabin into an oppressive silence. "What do you want?" Mary managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. "It was not meant for you," it said, the words echoing in her mind. "What wasn't?" she asked, clutching Sophie and Brian tighter. The figure extended a hand, long and skeletal, pointing toward the forest. "The land," it said. "It calls to those who do not belong." Mary shook her head, confusion and fear overwhelming her. "We didn't mean to trespass. We were just camping," she stammered, her voice breaking. The figure remained still, its form rippling like smoke. "Leave," it said, the word heavy and final. Mary swallowed hard, her instinct screaming to obey, but her body frozen in place. "And if we can't?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to dissolve, its form melting into the shadows until only its voice remained. "The forest will take what it is owed." And then it was gone. The oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly, but the silence was deafening. Mary looked down at Brian, who stared back at her, his face pale and terrified. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Mary stood, pulling Sophie and Brian close. "We run," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. And with that, she led them back into the forest, the darkness closing in around them once more. The forest seemed alive now, shifting and breathing around them. Each step sank into the earth, the ground soft and pulsing underfoot like flesh. Mary tightened her grip on Sophie, carrying her while urging Brian forward. "Don't stop," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. The trees creaked and groaned, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Shadows darted in the periphery, quick and fleeting, just beyond the faint moonlight. The whistle returned, not distant this time, but all around them. High-pitched and piercing, it stabbed through the silence, sending chills down Mary's spine. Sophie buried her face in Mary's shoulder, her tiny hands gripping tightly. Brian stumbled over a root, falling to his knees. "Get up," Mary urged, her voice sharp with panic. I can't," Brian sobbed, his strength failing. Mary knelt, pulling him to his feet. "You have to, Brian. Please keep moving." The whistle warped into a cacophony of overlapping sounds, moans, growls, and distorted whispers. They seemed to come from everywhere, at once, closing in. Brian wiped his tears, nodding weakly as he forced his legs to move. The trees thinned ahead, revealing a faint glimmer of light. Mary's heart leapt. "Look, there's something there." She pushed forward, her pace quickening despite the ache in her body. The light grew brighter, flickering like fire. As they broke through the final layer of trees, Mary froze. Before them was a massive clearing, its center dominated by a towering bonfire. The flames licked the sky, casting long, dancing shadows across the forest edge. Around the fire stood figures, dozens of them. They were motionless, their heads tilted downward as if in prayer. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, their robes blending seamlessly into the darkness. Mary's breath caught, her legs trembling. "We can't go this way," she whispered, pulling Sophie closer. Brian clutched her arm, his eyes wide with fear. "What do we do, Mom?" Before Mary could answer, one of the hooded figures turned its head toward them. Its face was pale, featureless except for hollow sockets where eyes should have been. A low chant began, guttural and inhuman, spreading among the figures like a wave. The fire flared brighter, the heat pressing against Mary's skin even from a distance. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. Then the chanting stopped. All at once, the hooded figures turned, their eyeless faces fixed on her and the children. They didn't move. They simply stared, silent and unblinking. "Run," Mary whispered, her voice cracking. This time, she didn't wait for them to follow. She turned and bolted back into the forest, dragging Sophie and Brian with her. Behind them, the sound of footsteps began. Slow, deliberate, and far too many to count. The footsteps grew louder, each step deliberate and measured, like the beating of a single heart. Mary's breath came in ragged gasps, her legs burning as she pushed herself harder. She couldn't look back. If she did, she knew she would never move again. Sophie's weight in her arms seemed to grow with every step, but Mary forced herself to keep running. Brian stumbled behind her, his feet slipping in the mud. "Mom, I can't. I'm too tired," he gasped, his voice barely audible. Mary's heart twisted. She couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to slow down. "Keep going, Brian. Just a little longer." The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in around them, the air thick with the smell of decay. The chanting returned, distant at first, then growing, swelling like the tide. The eerie, guttural words bounced off the trees, vibrating in Mary's chest. Her mind reeled, the panic overwhelming her, but she kept running. Ahead, through the trees, a faint light flickered once more. This time it was different. It wasn't the fire. It was the light of a house. The outline of a structure, old, dilapidated, but solid, stood against the dark horizon. "Look, Mary gasped, pushing them forward. "It's a house. We can make it there." The light beckoned, a small hope amidst the growing dread. But the footsteps behind them didn't falter. They were gaining. Mary could hear the breath of something close now, the wet, labored panting of the things chasing them. She pushed herself faster, her body screaming in protest. Come on," she urged, her voice strained with fear. Brian was barely keeping up, his legs shaking, his face pale. The light of the house grew brighter, but it felt farther away with every step. Her pulse hammered in her ears as the sound of the chase intensified. Closer, closer. Suddenly, the house was upon them. Mary lunged toward the door, pulling at the handle with shaking hands. The door creaked open, and they tumbled inside, slamming it shut behind them. The house was dark, the air thick with dust and the scent of mildew. Mary stood panting, holding both children tightly against her. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a way to secure the door. But there was nothing, just bare walls and broken furniture, the floor covered in rotting leaves. A sudden crash echoed outside. Something slammed into the door, rattling it on its hinges. Mary froze, her heart stopping in her chest. The thing outside was huge. There was no mistaking the force of its attack. Another crash. The door splintered. It wouldn't hold much longer. "Mom, what do we do?" Brian whispered, his voice full of terror. Mary's mind raced, but there was no way out. She could feel the heat from the fire in the distance, growing stronger. They were surrounded, and the creatures were closing in. The door rattled again, louder this time, the hinges creaking under the force of whatever was outside. Mary's breath caught in her throat. They were running out of time. Brian trembled in her arms, and Sophie clung to her, the weight of her tiny body feeling heavier by the second. She turned, desperate, her eyes scanning the room. There had to be something, anything to help them. But there was nothing. Only dust, decay, and the oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow everything. The door splintered again, and Mary flinched, her heart racing. Another crash. The wood cracked, the sound echoing through the empty house. She couldn't let them in, but she had nothing left to fight with. Her hands shook as she pulled Brian and Sophie toward the far corner of the room, pressing them into the shadowed space. The door buckled again, the hinges finally giving way. A crack of light pierced through the room, casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. And then, the creatures entered. They were monstrous, their eyes glowing like embers, their forms hulking and distorted. Mary felt the temperature drop as they moved closer, their presence filling the room with an unnatural cold. The air seemed to thicken, suffocating her. Her heart hammered in her chest. And then, from behind them, a sound, a soft, distant sound, cut through the tension. A whistle. Faint at first, but growing louder. The creatures paused, their eyes shifting toward the door. It was a sound she recognized, the same eerie whistle that had sent them running before. For a moment, everything was still. And then, out of the darkness, a new figure appeared in the doorway. A tall, imposing figure, cloaked in shadow, standing perfectly still. The creatures hesitated, their glowing eyes flicking between the new figure and Mary. The air seemed to hum with energy, thick and electric. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, as if it commanded the very darkness itself. And then, without warning, It raised a hand. A wave of cold energy surged through the room, knocking the creatures back, their forms writhing in the sudden force. Mary watched, breathless, as the figure moved closer, its face still hidden beneath the shadows. The creatures fell back, their snarls growing quieter. The air began to settle, the oppressive weight lifting just enough to breathe. Mary blinked in disbelief as the creatures retreated, stumbling back into the night. And then, the figure turned to her. Its face was not a face at all, just a void, a swirling darkness where features should have been. "Go," it said, its voice low and calm.
Now.
Mary didn't hesitate. She turned to Brian and Sophie, grabbing them both by the hand, and they ran. Out the door. Into the night. The figure didn't follow. It simply watched as they fled, its presence dissolving into the shadows. The forest was silent once more. But Mary knew that silence wouldn't last long. The creatures would return. And next time there might be no one to stop them. They ran, their legs aching, their breath ragged as they fled through the darkened woods. The moon was hidden behind a thick veil of clouds, leaving them in total darkness, save for the dim light from the distant bonfire. Mary's mind raced, thoughts crashing into one another as they stumbled through the underbrush. Behind them, the forest seemed to come alive, whispers and rustling sounds creeping from every direction. But the creatures, those twisted, horrific beings, were no longer chasing them. The figure in the house had made sure of that. And yet, despite their temporary escape, the sense of danger never faded. It clung to Mary, wrapping itself around her like an iron grip. "Mom," Brian gasped, his voice cracking. "Where are we going?" Mary didn't answer at first. She couldn't. Her mind was still clouded with the events that had just unfolded. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the quiet sounds of the forest. She had to keep moving. The figure had given them a chance, an escape. But Mary knew it was only temporary. They couldn't outrun the darkness forever. "We just need to keep going," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. The path ahead was unclear, the trees thick and oppressive, but it was the only option they had. Brian fell behind again, and this time, Mary didn't stop to wait. She couldn't. Sophie whimpered in her arms, her small face pale and drawn with fear. "Stay with me, baby," Mary whispered, brushing her hair out of her face. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the oppressive silence broken only by their hurried footsteps. Then, ahead, a faint glow appeared. It wasn't the fire. It wasn't the house. It was something else. A break in the trees. A clearing. They stumbled into it, and Mary froze. In the center of the clearing stood a stone monument, ancient and worn with time. It pulsed with a strange, cold energy. For the first time, Mary felt the weight of what they had entered. The land itself was alive. And it was hungry. Suddenly, the forest was quiet again. The creatures had stopped chasing. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. She knew that no matter how far they ran, the forest would always find them. And it would never let them go.